Dun, 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 dun. 1, 2, 3. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Chalkboard History. Take 2. We are filming on, what is it? Wednesday, May
28th?
May 28th. In the year of our Lord, 2025. My goodness. Remember when we waited for the 21st century and then on December 31st, 1999, we were all going to die, and Cheairs like, I don't even know what you're talking about. The computers were all going to
reset,
come to life and reset, and the world would end, and the internet was just getting cool. And
my husband's parents had a whole grocery store in their basement. I mean, the kids went down there and shopped for the next, 4 or 5 years. So many things.
I remember when I woke up in the morning, I looked out the window hoping it wasn't like Stephen King's The Stand outside. And then it was just normal, and all the computers did what they were supposed to, which is click over to 2000. Mm-hmm. And then here we are
25 years later.
Yeah, a quarter of a century later, which is really something else. So as the clock ticked over, I was working on my first book.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. And now you are working on book number 4.
Number 4, because George Wagner wasn't cool enough, and he got kicked to the curb.
By the Cheairs family. You became intrigued with this family as you began researching them and decided a book needed to be written, right? And that book has the scope, the scale of that book has expanded greatly, and you're now well over 600 pages. And I have to say, I have had the profound privilege of reading it in segments as it's come to life, to give some editorial input. And I've told you already, I believe it's the best thing you've written. And it's a fascinating book. The family themselves are fascinating, but it's also a slice of American history. I mean, they are unique, but they are also representative of what's happening in this country in the 19th century, and you've done a really good job of knitting that together. So we wanted to give folks just a little bit of almost a sneak peek of coming attractions, and we were going to talk about that a little bit. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. This family, just like pretty much any family in America that has white skin, is a family of immigrants. So tell us a little bit about Jean de la Cheairs. Who was he, and how did he end up in America?
So de la Cheairs was born in France. He was a Protestant. France was run by the Catholics. I mean, they had a king, but it was really run by Rome. A lot of rules. So, anyways, he went to Britain and eventually came to America, and he got here in the early late 1850s, I think. But he ended up in New Amsterdam, which is really cool because he's down there at the lower end of what we know as Manhattan Island. Mm-hmm. Where I think in the first couple of paragraphs of the book, I wrote about, that's where the World Trade Center towers stood. And so that was his immersion into what becomes, the United States. And eventually they moved to Maryland, and then the family ended up in North Carolina. So, there's a kid born and another one, and the generations pass. And eventually there's Nathaniel Cheairs. They changed the name. They Americanized it and went away from de la Cheairs to Cheairs, and it was spelled phonetically Chairs or Chairs. And at some point, an E got stuck in there, but.
And you changed that in the book, which I like. You use the original spelling until they change it.
Well, and that was the spelling.
In the book.
That's what they used. Yeah. And I can't tell you, I don't know why they changed it. Somewhere between Nathaniel III and Nathaniel IV, mm-hmm. it swapped. I think the fourth, mm-hmm. the one who built Rippa Villa, was really the main impetus for that. But they came here to Middle Tennessee in 1811. Mm-hmm. Bought 300 acres. And Nathaniel Cheairs at that time was not a young man. I mean, gosh, he was born in 1764, so 36 plus. He's 47 or 48. Mm-hmm. And he and his wife, a whole gaggle of kids and a handful of slaves right here, mm-hmm. just a little east of where we are, started carving out a life. And then their last surviving child, Nathaniel IV, who always went by Nat or NF Cheairs, was born here in December of 1818. So, this was his home. And that's where that's where the writing started. It started because of deed work. I was trying to figure out the boundaries of Rippa Villa, and then it just went from there.
Well, and in all these land trades and buying and selling of land, you begin to discover a whole community of folks that are kind of carving out their lives here together, and certain names like Thompson and Peters and Wade begin showing up over and over again. So this is partly a story about the Cheairs family, but it's partly a story about this community as well as it evolves. And it's just like they're representative of many families. This community is representative of communities that are being carved out of the wilderness. But this family doesn't just stop here. Several of Nat's brothers and sisters move even further west.
Well, one of the things I learned early on, because I've never lived in Franklin, although I've worked there for over 20 years. I've always lived in Spring Hill, and now I live outside of Spring Hill. I didn't know that it's commonly said that Spring Hill was founded in like 1808. Well, yeah, kind of, sort of. There were a few people around here in 1807, 1808. But there is no town at all.
Right.
And the name Spring Hill doesn't exist in any way until the late 1820s. And it's Henry Wade. And Henry Wade buys land and starts selling town lots along Columbia Avenue. And that becomes really
the nucleus
of what becomes a town. At one point, they were considering calling it Petersburg, and James Peters didn't want anything named after him. So then Wade started selling property in Spring Hill, which was really initially one word. It wasn't two words. It was one word, and then that became sort of the village. The town wasn't officially incorporated until the early 20th century, so I learned a lot about just what the village or the town or the community was. And then, so Nathaniel died in 1846. He and one of the sons had already been out in Mississippi. And so, like the sort of white experience, which is expansion, they're going everywhere. So there are 6 brothers and sisters that I focus on in the book. So these are the 6 children of Nathaniel and Sarah Cheairs. And that is Nancy, Louisa, Thomas, John, Martin, and Nat. There's another sibling, Polly, who I focus a little on, and they had a couple of other kids that lived, but they died as young adults, and had a couple of babies that died. But I focus on really the 6. Louisa ends up in Missouri because she marries a guy named John Campbell. Thomas, who's the second youngest son, he went to Mississippi with his father, which is actually where Nathaniel died. They had to bring him back from Mississippi in October, so wouldn't have been pleasant. That was probably not pleasant. But then the estate got busted up, and all these slaves that broken up, and everybody gets a little of this and a little of that. And through the work that our director of African and African American history did, Christy Farrow, she found out early on, because we were drilling down on some of the enslaved people, and she found out that one of the slaves, a guy named Gilbert, was actually fathered by Nat Cheairs. And right away, it was clear to me. I was like, I'm not just writing now. Now I'm not just writing for the staff or understanding some basic parameters. I'm like, I think George Wagner,
this is a bigger story.
The elbow or whatever. I'm like, I think I have to write a book.
Yeah.
And, I think starting with deed work and then just being curious, but something about Gilbert's story and the fact that Nat had fathered a child with an enslaved woman named Mary or Mary Ann just before he got married to Susan McKissick. I was like, oh boy, Rippa Villa is a little different. And before I forget, we also found out that Rippa Villa was 2 words, which we caught, as we often do, 18 shades of hell from people about, why are you changing the name? And we're like, well, we're not changing the name. We're changing it back to what it was. And then we found letter after letter after letter that Nat wrote, and it was clearly R-I-P-P-A, capital V-I, and we don't know what it means. Villa, but who knows what the Rippa means. And so it started to be a lot of fun. Nathaniel started things. Nat bought land right where we are, built this house about 1850, and oh my God, they were so wealthy. They were the Cheairs brothers and sisters. There's a chapter in the book, Brothers and Sisters. I think between the 6 of them, I mean, they had to own 350 people.
Yeah, at least.
And this was their world. But then I started to explore really the political world. Because they all know what's happening in the 1820s and the 1830s and the 1840s too, as they're growing up and getting married and having kids.
And they're involved, and they're politically active, and
Whigs. They're all Whigs.
Yeah, yeah.
They're Methodists and they're Whigs.
It doesn't matter that James K. Polk, the Democrats growing up down the road there, they're Whigs, and that's contrarian to Murray County, which is largely Democratic.
Well, Polk couldn't even win the state when he ran for president.
Yeah.
He lost Tennessee. Polk actually won because he cobbled together enough Democrat votes up north. So yeah, the whole Whig component of it was interesting. Spent a lot of time with Andrew Jackson. He certainly was the people's man.
Yeah.
Standing up to secession, and I really learned a lot about Tennessee. I knew Tennessee was divided. I didn't know how divided it was. I mean, the division between Williamson and Murray County. And boy, the conversations that must have gone on around here.
Have you landed on, is there one character in the book that you would say is your favorite, that was most enjoyable to write about, either because you admire them or just because they're so outlandish that
I had no idea. So Christy and somebody else who works here, Jenny Peach, is our education coordinator. We knew there were papers in Missouri that were connected to Louisa Cheairs Campbell's family, and they just found like the mother lode, and that opened up another door in Mississippi. And
you went out there.
Yeah,
you made a trip.
Well, I went to track down Thomas Cheairs' line.
Yeah.
I haven't yet made the trip for the other one. So the answer is, it's Jack Campbell. Yeah. John Nathaniel Campbell was Louisa's oldest boy, so this would be Nat's nephew. And I knew right away he was a Confederate soldier. He'd served in the Mississippi unit. He was at the Battle of Stones River. Jack is... the Campbells are hard to like. Well, let me rephrase that. They're hard not to dislike. Because they're just often petty and obnoxious and fighting with each other.
Yeah.
But Jack he's interesting. He gets sent down to Yazoo County by his father, which is, it's a jungle. And he gets married, and
you talked about how it's a hostile environment, regardless of color, regardless of how much money you have.
Ugly, hot,
so many ways to die.
Filthy,
Panthers,
snakes, water, bugs,
mosquitoes, disease,
gross, slashing, burning, trying to create a life. Well, I think one of the most incredible letters I've ever read is Jack recounting the death of an enslaved woman who got lost. And he knew her, old Sally, and trying to find her.
Goes looking for her,
and they're searching for days. Of course, she's dead. And they find her body, and the vultures. They saw the vultures, and as you read it, he's a slave owner, but he knows she's a person.
Yeah,
like he knows it, and that's a moment when, as like a writer or a historian or whatever, you see this god awful contradiction that I think Jack Campbell grew up in.
Yeah.
He grew up in this almost maniacal world of human struggle and control and greed and virtue and avarice and all of this stuff, and they're all stuck together down in the almost what today we'd call the Delta. So he was fascinating. And then he died. His mother died right after the war, and
hers is a sad death too, because she's by herself, right? She has one serving person with her, but there's not a single family member with her.
Who was an old slave, had been down in Yazoo.
Yeah.
Owned by, I think, John Campbell, who gave her to Jack, and then after Jack died, she went with Louisa. Louisa's health was wrecked by the war. She died alone in Springfield, Missouri. And then Thomas Cheairs, the other, so Nat's older brother, he died in Mississippi right before the war. Yeah. I found out he was buying land in Tunica County, and as we were going through all these deeds, because like we're deed freaks now, he's buying land in Tunica County, and guess who else is buying land? Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Oh.
You know, and we started... Yeah, and so indirectly then you find these things like deeds for human beings, where Forrest is buying 100 people because he's selling them. He's buying them to sell them.
Yeah.
Because he's going to move them downriver and sell them in New Orleans, and
everybody's all tangled up.
It's all... And I go through, really, especially in those 30 or 40 years before the war, I go through all the presidential elections. I go through all the governor elections. So, yeah, it's kind of political, but, you know, that's America.
And that's the world they were living in.
And that's the world we live in. Like, we don't know Trump is president, or that Biden was president.
Or that we're following all the different things.
Or that Bill Lee is the governor. I mean, we're not clueless, and we all have opinions and thoughts about it. And so I dabbled in their opinions and their thoughts. I don't know if it's the best thing I ever written, but it's probably been... I thought my last book was actually the most fun I ever had. My first book, I just have to tell you, anybody out there who likes my first book, that's great. It sucked to write because I didn't know where I was going with it. And it was like, ugh. There were times I couldn't finish it, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do, and I wanted to make sure I was right. And so the last book was fun, Baptism of Fire.
Yeah.
This one's been wild.
It's evolved. So you've brought many of these figures full circle, right up until the end of their lives, and you have written a lot of death scenes.
Everybody's dying.
Which one was the hardest to write?
Death? It wasn't hard, but it was Nat. It was.
You spent a lot of time with him.
Well, and when you, it's strange. I remember when I was finished with Hood and Schofield in my first book, because you live with dead people.
Yeah.
But with Nat, I lived with him, and then I put him in the ground. So that was very. I don't know if it was poignant. It's not sad. It was. You live with someone for a while, and you do get to know them, a little bit. But I think the one thing I learned long before I put him in the ground, was about how impactful Reconstruction is, what was happening in Tennessee, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the Klan attacking, intimidating children in Spring Hill.
Right.
These are the things we need to stop with the frankly some of the bullshit excuses about the Klan, because there's no defense. I don't care what anybody says. There's no defense for what went on. Do I understand it as best I can? Yeah, but that doesn't mean that we have to make excuses for it anymore, because what they were doing, and I think honestly what families like the Cheairs were doing, which was just sitting back, like, well, I'm not involved. But they're not doing anything
to prevent it.
They know who's president. Grant. They're not voting for Grant, let me tell you, because all these old Whigs became Democrats. And the Democrats were the conservative faction of the country. And once Reconstruction was over, and with its successes, between legislative maneuvering and the Supreme Court intervention, we are as impacted by that era as anything to do with the Civil War.
And one of the interesting figures you write about in connection to that, because the Supreme Court's going to make two rulings. There was a wonderful Civil Rights Act passed in 1875 that looks very like the same one that's passed again in 1964. But it was passed in 1865, and then the Supreme Court overturned it in 1883, said it was unconstitutional because you cannot legislate what private citizens do. And then a second legislation passed in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson, or not legislation, but a Supreme Court ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson. And there's a dissenting voice in both of those rulings, and it's a man named Judge Harlan, and you write about him. You include part of his dissent. Say a little bit about him, because there are people who are taking a stand for what they believe is right, even in the midst of that, and he becomes a part of the story too.
There's always somebody. Harlan was that guy, and he predicted that Plessy versus Ferguson would be viewed in the same light as Dred Scott.
And he was right.
He was right. But he was just a voice. And as that is happening, Frederick Douglass is almost gone. And the sad outcome is that we didn't get around to fixing those problems until the 1950s and 1960s. Yeah. And if we're honest, if you quizzed people, if you grab two groups of people, black and white, and you see how radically divergent our thoughts are still about slavery, about the Confederacy, about Jim Crow, about John Harlan, we're getting closer to being on the same page, but we have been so ripped apart on issues of race. And this has been a look at the United States. This book has turned into, I never thought I'd read a book about American history, but I was like, what the heck? I mean, nobody told me I couldn't write about Spring Hill and Franklin, so I thought, I'll just write about this. And to look at the world through their eyes. And so if you start with Nathaniel Cheairs, and you go to Nat, and then you go to, so you can grab his siblings. So then the siblings' kids, and I go usually one generation further. Yeah. And all the way into the 20th century, they all knew. They all knew. I think recently, I haven't added this to the book yet. This is one of Louisa's children, Sarah Rush Owen. There's an incident with her brother. Her brother ends up living with and having a child with a woman named Chloe, who's black. And William Campbell, Rush's brother, died. And so Chloe, there was, estate stuff going on. And there's a letter that Rush wrote to some attorneys who were handling the real estate stuff. And she does everything but say the N-word.
Oh gosh.
It is almost an obscene letter written in 1901 or 02 about how Chloe had debauched my brother, meaning, it was her fault, and it
that
was
he had
just
descended to this.
It's just dripping with, and I as I tell the story, I can feel myself. It's just disgusting. Like, now, do I understand, again, as best I can, why Rush felt that way? Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. When I look at the world that she grew up in, no wonder she was disgusted with her brother, but even more disgusted with Chloe. That how dare she violate, the sanctity of my brother's, race. It's just, ugh. And then you see that's who we were. And the other thing is, it's easy to rag on the South. Yeah. It became so, racial segregation became so popular and cool and easy that it leaked into the North and out West. And it's not until the 50s and the 60s. And now 1960 is now 65 years ago. Yeah. I've been saying for a long time, we're 50 years removed from civil rights. We're now we're finally confronting the ghosts of the past. And that it's taught me a lot. And it's taught me that we're so lucky to live in this era, because some of that stuff was downright ridiculous. Yeah. And that also doesn't mean that somehow they're like these monsters. Because sometimes what happens, I think, is like, oh, they're terrible, so we never want to learn anything. Yeah. Frederick Douglass, in his last, I don't know if you've read that part yet. I go through his last speech. Yeah. This is 1894. He speaks at a church in D.C. He talks about all the setbacks. This is a black man who he'd seen it all. And he talked about the setbacks. But he talked about, he still had hope. He still had hope for the future. That the country would right itself. And somewhere at the end, I've got to get to that point that we really have. It just, oh gosh, it's taken us a long time.
Well, and that's part of the story includes people who helped make that happen. So one of the figures that we talk about a lot here at Rippa Villa is a woman named Anna Bunch. She lives here with her family in the 1880s. She's working and living here on the farm, raising 5 kids here. Her daughter, Ella, ends up having a grandson who fights in World War II, comes back here, is involved in an altercation in Colombia that eventually leads to the Columbia race riot, which becomes one of the precipitating events that kicks off the civil rights movement. So we have characters in your book that are part of what's going to change that's going to bring about that change. Thurgood Marshall will come here to defend some of the men that are arrested in that case. And
you know what Marshall ends up doing? He's the lead attorney on Brown versus the Board of Education.
And in that case, he reaches back to Judge Harlan and uses a piece of his dissent where Judge Harlan talks about the Constitution being a colorblind instrument, that it always meant everybody, you know, and so there's full circle moments there and key players in your story that help write that.
Well, it's not my story. This is a story.
The story that you're writing, yeah.
This is a story about us. And just like in our own families, there's always somebody. There's always somebody. And, you know, it's hard to admit that your brother or your sister or your parents or your uncle or the guy that you worked with or the person you were once married to or whomever was a drug addict, alcoholic, abuser, racist, bigot, whatever it is.
Yeah.
It goes on all the time. And it's easier to turn a blind eye, to make excuses and ignore it. And boy, this has been a revealing look at the country. And I think that, like what we shot earlier about the 250th, we've really come out of the depths.
Yeah.
And that is something that I think we should all take to heart. We are often told it's never been this bad and we're so divided, and well, basically what we should say is, well, there's no hope for the future, let's just quit now. No. If Frederick Douglass, as an aging, tired man in 1894, could say, I acknowledge the issues, but I remain hopeful.
Yeah.
That allows people to build on that. And to go back to like Rush, Owen, you know, her lineage and people like her, they moved beyond that. They stopped looking at someone simply because of the color of their skin. Because for some people, they could never get beyond that. And other people finally, because society changed, realized that, well, that's just a skin tone. That's never supposed to have been the divider, right? Because all men are created equal. And Judge Harlan, oh, man. What did I say in a meeting recently? You put up statues to Roger Taney, the author, lead, Supreme Court Justice when Dred Scott comes out. I don't know that there's a statue to John Harlan. And there probably should be. Well, there'll be a statue to Thurgood Marshall in Columbia.
Very soon.
Because there's a group down there that's putting Thurgood down at the in the roundabout that's going to be in 8th and South Main. And what a moment that will be for people to learn about, what life was like in Murray County in 1946.
Yeah.
Not just 1861. So
the Cheairs story is an American story. And I think anybody's going to be able to find truth in there that really resonates. And
you know what? Tennessee is an American story. Tennessee is a very unique and special place. It has been the intersection of so many things. I think the title is going to be, what is it? The Cheairs family, Rippavilla and the Cheairs family, Cheairs family and Rippavilla, the old Union, war, and the rebirth of freedom. Because he was right. He was right when he said in 1863 that that's what we were looking at, a rebirth of freedom. And a freedom for everyone to let go of the past that we needed to cut loose and embrace the good in us and move forward as one. And so hopefully we can do a little bit of that in the future. Anything else?
I think that's good.
All right, everybody.
You guys getting to read this soon.
It should come out, well, I don't know, this winter.
Yeah.
Next spring. I'm at 640 pages, so I got to finish soon or nobody's going to want to read it. Anyways, it'll come out soon. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.